Hi, I'm Amy Desai, editor here at Move Smartly. I hope you'll excuse my slightly noisy introduction to this episode today as I record from my hotel room in Seattle as I'm away for a family occasion. In addition to the usual hotel noises, apparently Seattle, like Toronto, is permanently under construction, so you may hear those sounds in the background as well. As a second part of our look into the zoning battles and density debates taking place in Toronto and Ontario right now, I think you'll find John's interview with the urban planning expert, Sean Galbraith, very useful today. Sean is an urban planner who assists clients in procuring planning permission approvals in the city of Toronto as president of Sean Galbraith and Associates Urban Planning Services. While my last interview in this series with lawyer and activist Phil Pothen outlined some of the political issues affecting these zoning battles and debates, John and Sean provide a slower and deeper look into the city bylaws that affect what we could build, renovate, and do to our homes in Toronto, and what is now going to be allowed, particularly regarding permissions for fourplexes to be built across the city. You can also listen to this, as always, on our Move Smartly podcast. The link to that podcast and links to our guests are in today's show notes. And if you find our show useful, please hit the subscribe button and share this show with others. It's very much appreciated. And now, without any delay, let's get to the show.
Sean, thank you so much for joining us today on our YouTube, or Move Smartly YouTube and podcast to chat about some of these big changes in the city of Toronto with respect to fourplexes. So thanks so much.
Very happy to be here.
Yeah, great. So why don't we kick things off just to, give us a little bit of background in terms of what you do to kind of set up the context so people kind of understand the business you're in and the type of work that you do.
So I'm an urban planning consultant. I've been a planner now for 25 years. In 2010, I started my own company focusing on small projects. Basically, the projects that are too small for big companies to really bother to take on. So things like minor variances and small rezonings. With a particular focus on small scale multi-residential development. So things like we're going to be talking today, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, small apartments, stuff like that.
That's great. So the perfect person to talk to, I guess, about these issues. So before we jump into fourplex, maybe if you can kind of define what a fourplex is for people who don't know. We have a lot of people who are relocating from other countries, and that might mean something different in their country. So maybe if you can just define what a fourplex is.
So it's pretty simple. It's basically it's a house or a dwelling, a semi or what have you that has 4 units in it. Sometimes prior to the recent zoning changes, if you wanted to do 4 units, an existing building, it would probably be considered a single unit with 3 secondary suites. And if you did a new construction, it would be considered a fourplex. There's some more technical distinctions between the two, but generally speaking, that was the case. Under the new changes, they don't differentiate. If you have 4 units in a dwelling, then it's going to be a fourplex.
Okay, so basically any home that has 4 units, it could be a detached home, a semi-detached home, even a row house in theory, or?
Yeah, I believe there's permissions for existing row houses. New ones, I don't recall are being covered, but those are going to be fairly rare, I suspect. Okay. In parts of old Toronto where you have old row houses, you may see them, but probably much less so in new ones.
Okay, so why don't we kick things off then by chatting about some of the challenges in terms of building fourplexes. Where you could even build them up until some of these recent.
So until this recent change, in Toronto, really the only place you could build them was the former city of Toronto, which had the extremely permissive R zone, the residential zone. It allowed basically everything from a single detached house to multiplexes to low-rise apartment buildings and everything in between. It was extremely permissive in terms of the built forms or the uses. And then they had other restrictions like floor space index and heights and building depth and things like that. Essentially, the older the part of the city it is, the more likely you were allowed to do a fourplex. And so when you got into the sort of post-war, more suburban typologies of North York and Scarborough and Central and North Etobicoke, they just weren't allowed. You had the much more restrictive RD zone, residential detached only. And so those would only allow for a house, a single detached house, what we call single family house. And then you could do like a basement apartment sort of thing.
I see. Okay, so much of those areas, and that's, so that's basically, is it close to 70% of the city where you couldn't build a fourplex?
Yeah, it's 70% in the ballpark. I think it was like 61 or something like that percent of the low-rise residential neighborhoods. So, which are generally referred to as the yellow belt.
Okay, and why are they called the yellow belt for those people who are curious?
So on the official plan, the different land use designations have different colors, and the neighborhoods, i.e., the low-rise residential zones, those are all colored yellow on the map. And so a planner named Gil Meslin a few years ago coined the term the yellow belt, and it's kind of stuck around.
Okay, very good. So now, in terms of, I mean, even let's leaving fourplexes aside, I mean, I thought it'd be helpful to kick off with some basic kind of planning and zoning lingo for people to understand some of these changes. You know, and what are some of the key criteria when, you know, you have a client who's trying to determine how much home they can build, whether it is a duplex or triplex or single family, and what are some of the restrictions?
Sure. So, I mean, zoning is opaque, and it's not easy for most lay people to really delve into and sort of slog their way through, which is why I have a job, frankly. Thank you for making zoning so difficult. You've kept me employed for 25 years. So when you're looking at a new project on the property, the primary restrictions in most of the zones, but they vary depending on the zone, will be sort of your building length or depth. Those are two different things. Your front and side yard setbacks, to some extent, the lesser extent, the rear yard setback, height, how many stories you're allowed to have, and then on the floor space index, or what's other places call a floor space ratio, which is basically the square footage of the house versus the square footage of the lot.
Okay.
Yeah, and those are the main considerations, I would say. There are other things like landscaping. I mean, there's always other things. The zoning bylaws are very long. Landscaping percentages and soft lakes landscaping percentages and parking and the width of the driveway and the slope of the roof. And there's any other number of considerations that go into designing an actual structure.
Okay, so for the floor space index, because I think it's an important one that changed. So that is effectively just
the biggest change.
Yeah, so that is the square footage, the interior square footage of the home above grade.
Yep.
Right, relative to the area of the lot, right?
Correct. Yep.
So, okay.
And not all parts of Toronto regulated building size this way. Frankly, it's a stupid way of regulating a building size. It's kind of an old way of doing it. The newer parts of the city usually don't even have FSI as one of the zoning requirements. They use like lot coverage and height and number of stories and stuff like that. But this measurement has sort of stuck around from zoning bylaws from the olden times of the 50s and 60s and stuff. And for multiplexes, the new zoning bylaw changes get rid of it entirely for multiplexes, but keep them in place for singles.
Okay. And you mentioned lot coverage. So that would just basically be the footprint of the home as a ratio of the lot? I
Yeah,
guess?
that's
Okay.
exactly right. But it would also typically take into account things like sheds, for
I see.
example. So if you have, it usually wouldn't take into account a garden suite. If you had that in the backyard up to a certain size, they
Okay.
would be exempted. But yeah, generally speaking, it's what's the footprint of the building relative to the area of the lot.
Okay.
Doesn't
Perfect.
take into account how many stories it is, which FSI does.
Okay. That's helpful. Now, aside from the fact that, I mean, we couldn't build fourplexes in 60+% of the low-rise
Mhm.
home areas. Out of the areas where, we could build fourplexes technically up until now, what have been some of the challenges that, you've found your clients have had, even, getting them approved or building them in the areas of Toronto where they're technically allowed?
So um, the biggest thing is that effectively nothing in Toronto complies with the zoning bylaw in Old Toronto, which is the only place where you could build them effectively before. There were like parts of like Long Branch where you could technically do it, but no lots actually complied. But generally speaking, there was no way to physically construct a building that fully complied with the zoning bylaw in Old Toronto because the lots are so small or unusually shaped, or they're really narrow but really deep. And so you had to go to minor variances through the Committee of Adjustment, which is where I come in. And the zoning bylaws in a lot of the city, especially the old city, simply do not reflect the prevailing sort of built form in the area. Like, you have areas where the FSI would be 0.35, which is the lowest in the city. Like, it's extremely low. But
Okay.
every house in the neighborhood is like 1.2 or 1.1 or something like has no bearing in reality. And it's because those zoning bylaws, when they originally were written, were designed to trigger variances as a layer of control. So that if you wanted to do anything to your house, effectively, you would have to go get variances, at least for FSI. You could not do anything as of right.
So let me unpack that for people. So basically a
Sure.
home or a lot that has an FSI of 0.35, which is the lowest, would effectively mean if the lot of the home is 30 by 100, so 3,000 square feet, you could not build more than 1,000 square feet. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay.
And the existing house on the lot is probably 2,500 square feet.
Okay.
Because it was built in 1901 before the invention of zoning or whatever it was.
I see.
And so when we invented zoning, some of the zoning was to, in theory, reflect what already existed on the lot. And some of it was specifically designed not to do that. It was designed to trigger variances as a layer of control added on top of all of the rest of the zoning bylaw.
I see. Okay. So you found in a lot of the city of Toronto, you were basically going to committee to get approval
for anything.
For anything. Okay.
Yeah. So like it could be a thing like where you have there's been over the last few years, there've been a succession of changes to the zoning bylaw, almost all of which have been positive. So things like getting rid of parking minimums, the multiplex changes, the laneway suites, the garden suites, like these are all really great things. And they have significantly reduced the number and the scope of variances that a given project would need. So like before you would have situations where, the house that you wanted to design fully complied, but you triggered a parking space variance and you had nowhere to put a parking space. And the city didn't want you to put a parking space in because that would actually be a worse situation. But now you have to spend a few $1,000s to go to the Committee of Adjustment and incur the risk of a refusal or the risk of an approval and your neighbor appealing it to the Toronto local appeal body. It's so unnecessary for such small stuff. The province has changed those rules through Bill 23, so there's no longer a risk of a neighbor appeal, which is good, but there's still a risk of refusal at committee of adjustment, and you have to go to TLAB yourself to try and win an appeal.
Okay, that's helpful.
Which
Now,
happens.
Okay. Now, one of the other challenges, I believe, is on the cost side. So, what were the fees associated when someone was building a fourplex in the past? Like, specifically charges, development charges in particular per unit.
So, I don't get into development charges very often with my clients. Those are usually when I'm out of the picture and down the road. But they were like, I had one client who wanted to convert her house into 4 units to do multi-generational housing. Her nieces and nephews, they would each have their own place or what have you. And she wanted to add 100 square feet to the house. Very minimal addition. Triggered like 3 variances in an area where a fourplex was permitted. And so went to committee of adjustment, got the variances approved. It was a fairly straightforward process. The costs for that were, under $5,000 for city fees and my fees. I think way under that, but pretty straightforward process. And then she had to go and she got the notification on the development charges and the parks levy, and it was going to be something like $150,000 to do the change.
Wow.
It was like utterly ridiculous, and it absolutely stopped the project dead in its tracks. There's no way she's going to spend that much money to provide cheap accommodation for her family members when adding 100 square feet to one of the floors. Like utterly ridiculous. Thankfully, the city has agreed that this makes no sense and is killing new projects, and so has now exempted up to fourplexes from development charges and from parks levy. So those costs are now zero, which is huge. It's a huge shift.
And did that happen with this recent change, or did that happen earlier?
No, the city had already done it independently.
Okay.
The province has also made changes to development charges and things like site plan control that will help significantly reduce some costs. But the city was already well on its way to doing a lot of the stuff that the province eventually put in place province-wide.
Okay. So awesome. So I think that sets us up well to kind of chat a little bit about these big changes.
Sure.
And maybe if you can unpack kind of the significance of them and what it opens up in terms of, people who might want to build, a fourplex in the city of Toronto.
So they apply to duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. Effectively, it's for every residential lot in the city of Toronto, every low-rise residential lot. There are a few minor exceptions, particularly around townhouses, but generally speaking, virtually every lot in Toronto, you can now do a low-rise multiplex up to 4 units. And the changes are, to some extent, they seem on paper somewhat minor, but in practice, I think they will have a potentially very large impact. So the headline one was deleting FSI for multiplexes entirely. So in those parts of the city where FSI applied, it no longer applies for duplexes, triplexes, and multiplexes. The city is saying, and the underlying philosophy throughout the multiplex thing is, if you want to do this, we will create a regulatory incentive for you to do so. In that these changes only apply to multiplexes. They do not apply to singles, so you shouldn't be able to use the fact that you can get, no FSI and different lengths and all the other stuff that we'll talk about. You shouldn't apply those to to make a new McMansion that you want to build, some crappy big ugly house with stucco on it or something. Like, no, that you still are limited in FSI and all the other things if you wanted to do one of those. But you get a bonus if you want to do a multiplex and provide housing for more people.
Okay, so basically now, I mean, anyone can build a fourplex pretty much on any low-rise lot in the entire city of Toronto. If I wanted to buy a mansion in the Bridle Path, I could drop a fourplex on there and piss off the neighbors.
Have fun. Yeah, good luck. Good luck making that math pencil. But if it does, I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing it. From Etobicoke to North York to East York to Toronto to Scarborough, this is now citywide.
Okay, so and the impact of the FSI exemption, I mean, kind of going back to our earlier chat, is really that it allows you to kind of, it sounds like, maximize how much you can build kind of on that lot, and in theory build more home without going to for a minor variance to the city for approval, right?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So the way it would work before is you could have, and this is speaking from experience, I've had a project like this where you had a box of a house, you've got the shell, and it complied with the front yard setback and it complied with the side yard setbacks, and you had the required rear yard setback, and the wall heights were fine, and the roof pitch was fine, and the number of stories was fine. You had the correct amount of parking, you have the correct amount of landscaping, all these other things, but you triggered FSI. Because for some reason, complying with every other component of the zoning bylaw that says we want a box this big, by converting the attic into a bedroom, now you had FSI up there, and now the box that we said was perfectly sized is now too big. Okay. The box hasn't changed in any way, shape, or form. You've just used the inside of the box differently, generating zero impacts. And so that for a fourplex will no longer happen. The city is saying, if you want to build this box and put 2 units or 3 units or 4 units in it, that's fine. We're not going to arbitrarily otherwise restrict the size of that box.
Okay, so I mean, going back to your example, as long as you meet the setback from the lot boundaries, your lot coverage is what it should be.
All those other things will still apply.
Yeah, and your height is within, you can build as much home as you can on that, in that box effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And in order to incentivize it even more, the city is also saying, okay, so not only are we deleting FSI as a requirement, but we're going to make sure that you can actually build 3 stories by giving you 10 meters building height as of right for a fourplex. Parts of the city, it's like 8.5 meters or whatever. We're giving parts of the city, it's also like 11 meters or 12 meters. There's some small parts of the city where the permitted height is like 18 meters building height. It's wild. But for a large part of the low-rise suburban-y parts, it's like 8.5 meters. And so, 10 meters for a multiplex. Sweet. And then also, if your lot size is within certain ranges, you can go 19 meters of building depth, where before you could go 17 meters for a single, and before that it was 14 meters for a multiplex. The bylaw actually sort of discriminated against multiplexes by saying, not if you want to do them, okay, but you have to make it even smaller than a house. Now we're saying, not only can you make it as big as a house, you can make it bigger than a house by 6 feet out the back, basically.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's massive. So if I'm building a fourplex in a neighborhood that currently only allows, 2 stories as an example, based on the height, what you're saying is if I build a fourplex by default, I can go 3 stories.
Yep.
Pretty much anywhere. I mean, anywhere in the city.
Yep. Yeah, there's no limit to the number of stories. The limit is in the height.
Height. Okay, sorry. But practically speaking.
Practically speaking, it's 3 stories.
It's 3 stories for a triplex now, or a fourplex.
Correct. And
Okay.
it's deliberate. Some people wanted it to be like 11 meters or 12 meters. And yeah, that would have been nice, but then you just end up with taller ceilings, not more
Yeah.
stories. Because
Yeah.
part of the problem is that when you get into 4 stories, now you're in a different part of the building code and you have to engineer the building differently. It's different stairs and probably like an elevator or whatever. It's a different thing.
Mhm.
And so the city said, I think reasonably so, 10 meters works. And maybe you need, if there's a particular slope of the lot or something, and maybe it triggers a variance, then that's something that they can consider on a case by case basis. But for a typical lot in a typical neighborhood, 10 meters, you're allowed as of right.
Mhm.
And if the neighborhood has a zoning limit of 2 stories, that doesn't apply for multiplexes, but it will still apply for singles.
So it's interesting. So a lot of these changes are basically multiplex only changes. The height,
all of them are multiplex only. Well,
right?
almost all of them are multiplex only changes.
Mhm.
The exceptions are, there were 2 little stupid provisions in the zoning bylaw pertaining to secondary suites. So, and this has been something that I've ranted about for years. The zoning bylaw prohibited changes to the front wall of dwelling to accommodate secondary suites, and prohibited a secondary suite having its own front entrance.
Okay.
The bylaw basically says if you had a single house, you could have as many front doors as you want. You could line the entire front wall of the house in front doors, provided that none of them provided the dignity of a secondary suite having its own front door facing a front lot line.
Okay.
So that stupid provision has gone away. And you're allowed to actually change what the front of the house looks like if you want to have a secondary suite. Now, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, as I understand it, will not be reviewed as adding secondary suites. There was a big question about that. So this will apply rarely anymore. But it was nice that they finally corrected this ridiculous mistake from the previous zoning bylaw from the 1980s, which probably carried it forward from the one from the 70s.
Now, a secondary suite specifically, is that generally just like a basement suite, or
Not necessarily.
or it could be any additional suite?
It can be any additional suite. So like I had a project that went to committee of adjustment last week, where it was a renovation to an existing row house, and they're changing it so that the front half of the building is 1 unit, 3 stories high, and the back half of the building is 3 stories, but slightly smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like a front to back semi as part of a row house.
Okay.
And that triggered some variances, but nothing particularly notable. And it got approved.
Awesome. So it sounds like, at least from what you're describing, a lot of these changes sound like they are designed to encourage either builders or families to build large, it sounds like family-sized units. Like a lot of these exemptions that allow for more living space, more height, like it sounds like it's, rather than building small little 1-bedroom apartments, like actually build family-sized rentals. Is that
that is definitely a goal of the city. And the city listened to the feedback that was given through the public consultation quite well. Like FSI was originally proposed to be maintained and no changes, and they listened to the feedback. Was like, if you maintain it, you will get 0 multiplexes in some neighborhoods, and so they got rid of it. Great. The city wanted to make sure that the changes that they were proposing were viable to create actual development. And so to some extent, it's a get the city out of the way and let people build, which is great. Frankly, it's a change in philosophy in the city, and I want to see more of it.
Okay. Yeah, that is awesome. And So one thing I wanted to add on, and you touched on it earlier, you know, you talked about garden suites so this change allowing fourplexes, I mean, does that allow people to also build potentially a garden suite? So in theory, 5 houses, you know, if you want to call them that, residential units on one lot.
100%. Yep.
Okay.
If the lot can accommodate it, absolutely. You can do a garden suite behind a fourplex or a triplex or a duplex or just about anything. Yep, absolutely you can.
Okay.
Provided it meets all the other zoning bylaw requirements, or you need variances or what have you. But yeah, yep, you can do it.
Okay.
You can also, if you did a fourplex or duplex, triplex, whatever, you can make it into a small condo and sell units. They don't have to be rentals.
Sorry, say that one more time. So if you did a fourplex, you can
condo
register, so you can condo it. So actually, okay.
And sell individual units.
Oh, okay, so sell them separately, basically. So basically, I build a 4-unit condo, right? Effectively, and then I sell them off as individual units.
Yep. There's nothing that says you can't do that.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yep.
That's super interesting. I didn't
in
realize
those cases, I don't recommend you do it with a garden suite, because that gets way more complicated. But if you just want to do a simple fourplex, you know, and sell individual units, you can do a plan of condominium and go through the plan of condominium process like any other condo building. And yeah, you can end up selling those units.
But I suspect that's pretty expensive, and we're probably unlikely to see a lot of that. Okay.
Yeah, it's not cheap. We don't have a process like the strata thing out in Vancouver or whatever, which is like cheaper and easier. But I mean, if land values are and the unit values are what they are, it might be worth it for some people to do that. It's an option for people, or you just make them rental, and that's also totally fine.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, so the other thing is, I mean, we touched on it earlier, the change to development charges.
I.e. zero.
Okay, so 0 charges from the city for each of the units, up to 4 units, right?
Correct.
And is that like a deferral, or is that like absolutely just no charges?
Zero. It's a 0 development charges and 0 park levy.
Okay. That's amazing.
Yep.
Okay.
It is.
So that's obviously a big change that's going to help, you know, kind of going back to, you talked about the numbers penciling in my dream of building a
huge
fourplex.
help.
Yeah.
Huge help. Yeah. The city is basically saying, to some extent, like, okay, we've heard you, industry. You said that these are all the problems that are preventing this from happening. We're going to get rid of most of them. Now it's your turn. Build. Give us the units that you said were being delayed because of these roadblocks. So let's see them. Let's go. We've gotten out of your way.
Okay, so on that note, so what do you anticipate happening? Because of course, one of the things that we hear a lot, and you touch on, is that it's hard for these developments to pencil, like to make the math work. So, I mean, what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see? Is it mainly going to be like end users building multi-generational homes? Like I see that a lot with garden suites and laneway homes. Or do you think we're going to get people just building them as an investment?
I mean, I think we're going to see both. I think it's going to take some time for the knowledge of this to sort of permeate throughout the city and people to start thinking differently about the land that they already own and the land that they might want to buy. So we're not going to see a flood of applications just, to start coming in. It'll start to be a trickle, and then people will say, oh, so-and-so did that over there. Can I do that on mine? Let's give Sean a call. Hey, can I do this? Yes, you can do this. And you actually don't need me. You can go straight to building permits. Sweet. Or maybe you need a variance and I can help out with that, whatever. I think I think most of it at the start will come from investors, people who are looking to build rental properties.
I see.
And then I think we'll start to see some multi-generational stuff coming in, probably in more the suburban wards rather than the downtown wards. And there's just going to start building momentum and building awareness, and and start generating units.
Okay, and do you think it's going to be more in people renovating homes, or like net new kind of ground up? Because I would think the latter would be harder or more expensive.
It's a good question. I think it will depend on the area of the city. I think in older Toronto, they'll see more renovations, because their buildings are so non-compliant with the zoning bylaw that you'll want to retain 50% of the walls so that you can maintain existing legal nonconformities and not generate variances while doing additions. So, because as long as you save 50% of the wall, you can add as big of an addition as you want, and it's not considered new build.
I see.
But in the suburban wards, where especially like if you have like old bungalows or whatever, like they're just not suited to be a new 3-story building.
Yeah.
And so I would say you're probably more likely to see tear downs there. The basements, the foundation of the basements might make that tricky, but people will find a way.
Interesting. So that's interesting. So, I mean, so people who have, can obviously renovate their existing homes to fourplexes, whether it is a detached or a semi. In the old city, Toronto, that is all allowed now, which is pretty massive.
It's allowed everywhere.
It's unbelievable. So, which kind of, brings us to the next question. So what is the next step in this process? The city gave it the thumbs up. Is there sort of an appeal process before it becomes legal and allowed everywhere?
So technically there is, whether or not there's an appeal process, there should not be an appeal process.
Okay,
there should not be an appeal process. And so I'll explain that. So there's these things called conformity exercises. So if the province says, cities, you shall include these permissions. And when the city adopts a new official plan or zoning bylaw to implement that, it is called a conformity exercise because it's bringing the local stuff in conformity with the provincial stuff. And when you do it that way, it is shielded from appeal because the city has no choice but to implement those things.
I see.
But when we, so the semi counter to that is, and multiplexes were done as a conformity exercise.
Okay.
Now the province says you shall allow up to 3 units per lot, and the city said, no, we want to do 4.
Okay.
The nearest comparison is the garden suites bylaw. So when that was put into effect, the province says you shall allow a garden suite behind a single, a semi, or a townhouse. The certain neighborhood associations said, okay, but you didn't say duplexes, triplexes, or multiplexes. And so we're going to try and appeal this bylaw because on those sections of the bylaw that pertain to duplexes, triplexes, and multiplexes, because you went beyond what the province said that you shall do. And it went to the Ontario Land Tribunal for a hearing, not on the merits, but on do you even have standing to file this appeal? And the Ontario Land Tribunal said, hell no, you don't. It was a conformity exercise, go away. And the garden suites bylaw, including for multiplexes, came into effect. If I had a hunch, I would say somebody is going to try and do the same thing for the fourplex version or fourplex provisions of the new zoning bylaw. I haven't heard that anybody's going to do this, but a lot of residents associations don't like it. And so I would not be surprised if someone tries that. My hunch is that the Garden Suites decision will be a nice precedent to say, thank you, but no thank you to your appeal. And then the multiplex stuff will come into effect. That would be my guess. I'm not a lawyer. They do their lawyerly thing and we'll see what happens. But it should be only basically the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing and some other what are called specified persons like agencies who are not going to appeal. Those are the only people who should be able to appeal, and none of them will do so.
Okay. So sometime this year, hopefully, all of this stuff will be passed, and
we'll know within the next month.
Oh, okay, that quickly.
Oh yeah, we will know within the next month, within a month, maybe by the end of, before the end of June, we will know if any appeals were filed or attempted appeals were filed. If none were filed, we're in effect. Go forth and multiplex.
Amazing. Now, we're getting close to the end, but I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. You touched on them. You mentioned the province came down and said triplex everything or allow triplexes everywhere. And the city said, well, no, that's not enough. We want fourplexes, which is fantastic.
We want to do a made in Toronto solution here.
That's
the city was already working on it.
Okay.
Most of the province was not working on this. And they had to be told, now you're allowing triplexes.
Okay. So does that mean that in other regions and municipalities of the GTA, today you can build a triplex, or do the municipalities have some time to put those policies in place? Like when are we gonna see triplexes even in the suburbs?
So the Planning Act now says that triplexes are permitted, certain to subject conditions, but generally speaking, triplexes are permitted, and any bylaw that doesn't allow them is of no effect.
I see.
So again, I am very much not a lawyer, but some interpretations that I have seen are that if you go in, a city cannot prevent you from doing a triplex. So if you wanted to do one in Brampton or whatever, the zoning bylaw says you can only do a single. Thank you very much for that opinion. No, you can do a triplex. Provided that you meet all the other box restrictions. I don't know that that municipalities are required to make them feasible.
I see.
They're only required to allow them.
I see.
Toronto is trying to make them feasible.
Okay, so that's the big difference why we may not see them anytime soon, because of the changes that you mentioned that Toronto is making, these effectively the multiplex or these fourplex only rules allowing up to 3 stories, no FSI limit, that are making them feasible. And basically the suburban regions are probably less likely to do that anytime soon.
Yep. So what the province has done is they didn't expand how big the box can be. They simply said within your existing zoning, whatever size box that is, you can have up to 3 units in there. They also said you can do like 2 units in the main and an accessory dwelling unit, like a garden suite or a laneway suite out back, and there's 3 units per lot. So yeah.
Okay, that's awesome. Is there anything else that you think is noteworthy worth touching on before we kind of wrap up today that maybe I missed?
So what I'm excited for is that this is all part of the city's expanding housing options and neighborhoods program. It started with garden suites. It went to a little bit of neighborhood retail stuff. It then did gardens, or then it was garden suites, and the sort of the development charges stuff was sort of tied in. They're moving on. They've got a whole work plan and time frame as to whether doing more stuff as part of EHON. And they'll be doing things like looking at the major streets and upzoning there. And then they're going to be doing things like low-rise apartment buildings and looking at those things. So the city is not done making changes to make it easier to build basically apartments or small condos. They are by no means done yet. And I'm excited to see what else they come up with, because so far it's been pretty good. It's been something I've been ranting about since at least 2017. And a lot of the stuff that I wanted to see is, so far it's in there. It's been pretty good.
Yeah, no, it is great. I mean, I follow you on Twitter quite a bit, and of course,
Yeah. I don't recommend that at all.
and a lot of the things that you post about, of course, a lot of the housing that was legal, I don't know, like 70, 80 years ago, these multiplex, 4-story.
We used to do it, no problem.
Yeah, exactly. In a lot of neighborhoods.
Absolutely. It was the norm. Like, before we invented zoning, frankly, we knew how to allow neighborhoods to sort of breathe, to allow them to expand and change and evolve over time. And so much housing was created that is just totally illegal under the current zoning regime. Like, you could never, like, doing a 5-story walk-up or a 4-story walk-up with like 30 apartments in it, like, oh my God, what a nightmare that would be. A full rezoning with like $200,000 in costs, and oh my God, until some recent changes through Bill 109 to speed up the process, you're looking at like 3 years to get approved, like friggin' nightmare. Yeah. And so no one does it. There's a reason why nobody does it, because the entire system is designed to say, no, you shouldn't do that. And that's slowly changing.
Yeah, and it's great. A lot of the things that you're talking about are the city kind of pushing for more density, more housing in existing neighborhoods, which is obviously
it's good.
The best build. Yeah, 100% it's good.
In every respect, it's a good way to do it. We've got schools that are underpopulated. We need more kids in neighborhoods. We've got community resources that are underfunded because we don't have the tax base to support it. This is the good stuff. We've got local retail that could use more customers within walking distance. Fantastic. You want to age in place. You're an empty nester, and you've got now this big house that you don't really need anymore, or maybe you have mobility issues. Cool. Split it up, multiplex it, get other people living there as well, and help you afford the cost of it. Like, there are no downsides to this, frankly.
Yeah. It's amazing, and it's exciting, and you're right. It's going to be exciting to see what the city has planned in the years ahead.
I'm very excited to see that, and I'm very excited to see the projects that people creatively come up with on how they can better use their land.
Awesome. Very good. Well, Sean, thanks so much for taking the time today to unpack all of these changes, and hopefully people can get some value out of it and start building some of their own fourplex in the months ahead.
Let's go. Let's do it.
Thanks again.
Anytime.